Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider Indianapolis Star. This is Mind Your Banners for Monday, July 29th, 2024. Summer's over, at least it is in college sports world. We are past media days now. I did enjoy the Friday afternoon news dump of House settlement. I don't know why we dumped that on a Friday afternoon, but we did. And pretty much everywhere around the country, practice is getting started this week. With me is Mike Niziolek from the Bloomington Herald Times. As always, Mike, we were both we're obviously going to talk a lot about IU football today, just kind of sort of prime the pump for fall camp. Um, we'll start at the beginning. We were both at conference media days last week. I don't know that we learned anything, terribly new. These media days have kind of become this thing where the beat writers just hear the head coach tell the rest of the league what the head coach has been telling the beat writers by and large for a few months now. Curt Cignetti pulled the curtain back on one or two things, but again, I would say by and large, a lot of what he said there we'd already heard in terms of no new injuries. It's clear that kind of Curtis Rourke probably has the inside lane to be QB1. Cignetti talked about how he's a lot more sort of hands-on with offense as opposed to defense. I mean, it was kind of everything you'd expect if you'd spent the last 7-8 months talking to Curt Cignetti every so often.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I had only seen Tom Allen at the event once, but I'd imagine, having covered Tom Allen for that season, that he did not provide sort of um, the showmanship that Cignetti touted himself as trying to provide everybody, the entertainment.
He did sometimes, maybe not the entertainment, but like I remember his first media days, he actually got some real kudos from the conference press corps for standing up there and saying he thought the Big Ten's playing on Friday nights was a really dumb idea. And his reasoning was like, I'm a high school coach. I'm going to speak my mind. To me, high school football needs to be preserved. And everybody's like, wow,
That's
this
on like
guy.
that's sort of a very specific subject. This was about
Yeah, fair.
Indiana and why can't we win here. His story, he kept citing fictional children that you wouldn't want to teach to be mediocre. I think it was Mary and Johnny were the fictional children that he used in his examples. Obviously some fun language. I mean, what was your just sort of impression of, I mean, this was his debut on the sort of national stage. I mean, he was sandwiched, I think I wrote this between Oregon and Michigan, and I thought, brought Indiana some publicity that they normally don't get and at these things.
I thought he went after Jed Fish. I think he went after Jed
But he
Fish.
was between those, like, I mean, between two programs that obviously command a lot of attention in terms of where he was situated in the day. Jed Fish was right before him, but I'm just
Oh, I
saying.
see what you mean. Yeah, no, because like I actually thought like Jed Fish was up there, and I know it's Washington, and there probably wasn't a ton of media out. But like media days are long and tiring, and everybody just gets talked at like relentlessly, and you just kind of you hear the same cliches and the same sort of pronouncements. And the Jed Fish was up there filibustering for like 20 minutes, talking about how much things have turned over at Washington, and the room just seemed like half asleep. And then like Cignetti got up there and he threw in a couple 8-letter words, and as you said, he kind of told some jokes, like he kind of deadpanned on Scott Dolson, his AD, and it felt like he actually kind of livened the room up a little bit. And again, like I talked to some friends who cover like Ohio State, a friend who covered, I think, who else did I see? Yeah, Penn State. And I said, like, this is just what he's been like since he got hired. Like, there's, somebody asked him about um the I guess you'd call it famous moment, viral moment at the basketball game. And, he just kind of said, hey, I'm 62, I'm 63. I just can't care what people think anymore. Like, I lose my filter. I'm trying to get these people fired up. I think the one thing, that you talk about, that whole sort of that thing about mediocrity. I think the one thing that does, kind of ring true through all of it is um, that he, and this is what I wrote after media day, is that he is not behaving like a coach who I don't want to say like a coach who doesn't think he can win now, because coaches are competitive people and they'll always want to try and win. But you get so many coaches that'll come in and almost immediately start giving you reasons why year one shouldn't count, or reasons why they need 3 seasons to, even in the portal era, oh, look at all this turnover and all these new whatever. Like Cignetti's whole thing is just like, what am I here to do if not win? And he talked obviously about his record, 13 winning seasons in 13 years. And he said, I've never done it at this level. I came to Indiana because it seemed like a challenge I'd done before, but now I got to prove I can do it here. But he also said, I thought it was interesting. He said, 3 years seems like forever in college football, but everybody acts like I can't win in Indiana. They were one score away from playing for a Big Ten title 3 seasons ago. So, like, what's the, why is this suddenly become an impossible job? And I talked to Mike Kadick a little bit about it on the side, and he basically just, like he said, that empowered us pretty much from day one. That the coach didn't walk in and say, you guys all stink, I'm just going to wait until I get my players. He didn't ask for patience. He said, hey, we're here to win. I know how to win. And if you do what I ask you to do the way I ask you to do it, we're going to have success. And, he's going to have, obviously, Cignetti himself has said many times he's got to prove it on the field. But, that I think you can understand where the optimism and the momentum around IU football come from when you listen to him talk like that.
Yeah, and I mean, sort of what we were talking about with the expectations or limitations. He was talking about the quote was, "Oh, if we go to a bowl game, it's a great year." Bullshit. That ain't the goal. The goal is to be the best. And I thought that was more. It was an extension of the Purdue comments. The most interesting part of his explanation, which he hadn't told before, he's always kind of said to us over the last 4 months since the Assembly Hall thing about Purdue, that getting overexcited. Um, why he included Michigan and Ohio State was sort of part of that, because he kind of like knocked on the table. He's like, we're going after those two, and so like to him, the bar isn't just beat Purdue, who's sort of always perpetually in sort of that middle group. It's to go after it. It's much higher than that, and that's sort of his philosophy. And I mean, obviously, he's got to cash some of these checks because he's setting the bar very high. I think a successful season is, keeping that streak of winning seasons for him going and reaching a bowl game. But obviously, I think if they're 7-6, he's not going to be thrilled with their sort of that final number.
No, I think that's fair. And again, like, I mean, he specifically explaining that like moment at the basketball game, said like people had been coming to him, as you said, and just saying like, "Hope we go to a bowl game. Would love to go to a bowl game," or
Well, and that's how you kind of frame the metric of success for the program. It's like if you make a bowl game, good year.
yeah. I mean, at the very least, like it should be a building block. And like they've been to 4 bowl games since 2007, so you know that's 4 bowls in 16 years or 17 seasons, however you want to, I guess it's 16 seasons. The point is, like that's not much. And Indiana's just trying to find that competitiveness, trying to find again those building blocks to stack on one another. And it is interesting to me the extent to which Cignetti, because it's also not like this wasn't his introductory news conference. Like he's been around this team for a few months. If he thought like, hey, I can't be talking about going to a bowl game, like this team's not anywhere near ready, then
You might have tempered those
yeah, I
comments.
think he'd pull it back at least somewhat. I don't think he'd be sitting here and um, throwing out some swears and talking about Mary and Johnny and mediocrity and whatever else. And listen, I mean, he said many times, he said it last week, and he's right. Like the portal has changed some of the calculus around this, and it's also changed the expectation a little bit. That if you have these NIL resources, if you're in a conference like the Big Ten that's competitive in all the ways that you need to be at the top end of the sport, you shouldn't necessarily have to think about the sort of rebuilding process, if you want to use that term that way. What I think Indiana's up to 46 new players, I think it is. So like, I mean, you're quite literally more than half the rosters turned over from last season. Now, that's a challenge unto itself. And, it was interesting to me sitting there listening to Jed Fish talk about everything, all of Washington's turnover and the coaches he had to hire, and he had like 1 or 2 starters returning or whatever. And I just remember sort of sitting there and thinking, man, like that sounds rough, Jed. And then I thought about it and I said, well, if you didn't really know much about Indiana's offseason, if you hadn't kind of been, kind of in the weeds with it, the way that obviously we get, on the beat and the way fans get and all that, if you heard Indiana saying that 46 new players and a whole new staff, you'd be like, man, like that's a you could understand why somebody might pick Indiana at or near the bottom of the conference as an example. Indiana was 17th in the Cleveland.com poll. I think where were they in our USA Today poll? I think they were 16th, 16th, I think. So the point is, like, it's there's a general consensus that Indiana is going to be one of the basement, one of the teams in the basement of the Big Ten. And Curt Cignetti kind of talked about, I thought it was interesting too. He said, I've been picked second to last in that conference once, and he said both years obviously were winning seasons. But what was interesting to me was there were two kind of different challenges. Like one was going into Elon. Elon had won like 12 games in the previous 6 years or something like that. And they lose their first game and then they tear off 8 wins in a row. They get to the FCS playoffs. They lose to Furman in the FCS playoffs by 1 point. And then the next year, I think they get to the playoffs again. And then the other time was when James Madison made its jump up from FCS to the Sun Belt to Group of 5, and JMU was picked second to last just because everybody kind of assumed it's transition. They'll struggle with the higher level of competition, and they tied for first in their division in the Sun Belt. So, it keeps kind of coming back to, I guess the consistent theme to all of this is basically just Curt Cignetti saying, I've done this before. I know how this works. I know how it looks. I know how to make it, I know how to do this. And I think when you talk to his players, you get the sense that they have confidence in him for that reason, that's translated with them, which is obviously ultimately the most important thing. You can get fans excited, but you got to get your players believing first and foremost. But I think it is why, again, for all the sort of obstacles and setbacks and whatever else you talk about with IU's offseason, and maybe not just this offseason, but let's say maybe last, 3.5 years or 3-4 years. I don't begrudge anybody their optimism, because you do look at what Cignetti's done and you sort of say to yourself, yeah, like there are reasons to believe this formula could work here too, essentially.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, anything else stand out in terms of some of the things we learned? I thought the fact that they won't have team captains was notable, just in terms of that hasn't happened since 1951. He has, and it goes back to kind of his blueprint, that he's not sort of veering from what he's found successful at past stops and what he's sort of his personal views on things. I thought that was notable, just considering the history of it. And Tom Allen had basically had like 4 to 6 captains every year he was here. I mean, it was a big part of their leadership team. And it's very much a sort of different process with Cignetti.
The other thing I'm trying to remember is, did he give you an answer on whether or not didn't he say he wasn't sure about tackling in fall camp?
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, I think I brought that up more than anybody on the beat. The idea that, because he sort of mentioned it in passing after the spring game, that was the only time they had tackled the entire spring, and they might not tackle again until week 1. And he had done that the previous year, especially because they were able to ramp up. And this year with FIU and is it Western Illinois in week 2, I'm not saying it's preseason, but some, a way to sort of have lesser competition to sort of adjust to, that he might not do it again. He said, he hadn't made a final decision about that yet. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of crazy to me in terms of, I mean, I get it. Offensive coaches are very sort of, especially ones with quarterback in mind, very skittish about injuries and things like that. But I mean, not tackling for, basically what, 9 months out of the year without, getting an experience, that's wild to me.
No, I mean, and I know like NFL teams, some of them have kind of been moving a little bit more in this direction. Like it's a tough row to hoe, because listen, Tom Allen, I know, tinkered with trying to do different things to stay healthier, and it things like paring back tackling, or rolling in a thud up, and I think Indiana tried some of the rugby approach at times, and sometimes it worked, and then there were there were multiple years in Tom Allen's last 3 or 4 where Indiana just could not hold position groups were struggling. The problem with an injury crisis is like it's like a slow acting thing. Like you actually don't feel the impact of the injuries right away. What happens is that forces you to plug a hole somewhere else, and then either that opens up a hole or it begins to wear down depth, and then somebody else gets hurt, and then you're playing more players more than they should, and then they start to get hurt because you're wearing them down more than you would prefer to. And so it's something that almost like becomes exponential. And so if you can almost like, it's almost like if you can stop it at the source, then it's not just that obviously you won't have a huge problem with injuries. It's also that you will avoid like sort of this long tail cascade effect, because what winds up happening when you have an injury crisis is usually what happens is you pick up a few that you really can't manage, and then it self-perpetuates where you start stretching yourself too thin. Other guys start to get hurt because you're playing them too much, or you're playing them out of position, or moving them out of position, move somebody else in that shouldn't be playing as much, or whatever. And that's how it kind of explodes on itself. But the flip side is like it's simplistic, but as you kind of talk about there, like you have to tackle, you have to practice contact.
Well, yeah, when you get to the NFL, like part of it is it's less about development and maintaining. In college, it's sort of like, how do you develop a freshman that's never going to tackle, in the offseason? That
Yeah.
seems like a challenge that's hard to overcome. On the other hand, the depth on this team we've talked about, especially, there's 4 or 5 positions where you just don't see depth. And so I get wanting to try to sort of preserve your roster integrity, because I think one of the keys to having the success Cignetti has talked about is maintaining sort of, a healthy roster. And so it's there's push and pull, but I mean, not tackling as the strategy. I mean, how do you overcome that? And maybe that's a question to sort of ask in like the coming weeks or even years, in terms of like, okay, so you don't tackle, how do you, I know there's circuit drills and all that, but how do you sort of maintain a high level of proficiency?
Let's talk about then, I guess, spinning this forward into some thoughts on fall camp. And I think that the first big one for me is the one that we really have just, kind of not been able to escape. Talking about whenever we've talked about football this summer, which is defensive line. You and I were talking about this because I was putting together, just kind of a camp primer. We were talking about this before we got on the call. On the one hand, you feel like, with some guys healthy, CJ West in the fold, you probably have a top line group that you really, that I don't know if you really like it, because you just don't know what you have. It's a first year staff, new coordinator, etc. But I think if you're Indiana, you feel, good about Kamara, West, Carr, maybe to some extent somebody like, of course, James Carpenter, or even, I know he changes positions, but he's got the experience, he's got the athleticism, Jacob Mangum-Farrar. On the other hand, you talk about any one of those players getting hurt and pulling them out for any extended period of time, which is just something that happens to linemen. Like you're just, you're in the thick of it all the time. You kind of struggle to know exactly where Indiana goes sort of to replace some of these guys. And that's why I think, line and where, if you want to talk about like younger players like, Tadarius Collins is one that we heard the old staff talk about a fair bit. Jamari Monet came up some. Where some of these younger players, Tyreek Tucker, who's a James Madison transfer, who's only a redshirt sophomore, didn't play a ton because he's still younger. Where some of these guys get up to coming out of the summer and into fall camp, I think is going to be really important, because you just can't count on the idea that your core 4 or 5 best linemen across, all your positions are going to be healthy pretty much the entire season. If they are, that's great. But offensive and defensive line, both, you just have to assume some guys are going to lose some time, because those are just the positions that are usually most heavily affected by injury.
Well, I don't know if you look at James Carpenter has played, you talk about normally teams have a rotation. He played 736 snaps last year, 625 the year before that, at defensive tackle. That is a ton of work, and hard to do And he'd be trying to do that for a third straight season. I'd imagine he, especially at the power 4 level now, maintaining that kind of workload would be very difficult. CJ West has played a lot, more reasonable sort of snap count, but I mean, those guys you're going to lean on. But you do need depth, like you said. In terms of defensive end, they have no experience really behind their top two guys in terms of like meaningful game experience. You mentioned Magnum Farrar. His pass rushing stat, I think he rushed the pass for like 90 times last year, had only done it 20 times in his first 3 seasons at Stanford, really wasn't asked to do that. So, I mean, you like that he's an experienced and veteran guy. But I think it's going to take him some time to adjust. We've talked about sort of Haynes, doing some different things with blitzes and defensive looks to sort of generate pressure. Because outside of Kamara, you don't really, and Carr to some extent, you don't really have a ton of pass rushing experience you can lean on. And it gets much thinner after that first group. Like you said, it's almost non-existent after Kamara and Carr.
Kamara is one like I'm very interested. I think he's going to be on my list of like we were talking about this too, like potential sort of breakout players. James Madison had, if you go back and look at it, one of the most disruptive defenses over the last 2 seasons in the Sun Belt. And in terms of like hard stats, I recognize, when you do get those havoc plays, tackles for loss, things like that, typically it's kind of multiple players contributing in different ways. But the players that were logging the stats most often were linemen, kind of consistently. And obviously, I know he's only coaching tackles now, but Pat Kuntz is over from JMU. So there's some consistency there. Kamara, like if you look at his profile, he had a tackle for loss in 21 of 23 career games at James Madison last year. He had 6.5 sacks and 17.5 tackles for loss. Like those are consistent. Those are numbers in terms of consistency. And he had sacks in 5 different games. So it's also not like, sometimes you'll see a guy with like 7 sacks, but it's because he had like 1 3-sack game and 1 2-sack game. And then he only had 2 sacks the other 10 games of the season. He had 5 games with at least 1 sack last season. Now he's a little bit smaller. He's listed at 6'1", 268. I think, was he out for the spring? He wasn't he? Or didn't he miss at least part of the spring?
No, he was there. He played the spring.
I'm thinking of Jalen Walker, the linebacker. You could really, we've talked a lot about guys that Indiana could really, stand to be able to handle that step up. And it's partly because Curt Cignetti has opted to bring a lot of these production over potential transfers in, which means he's gone down to the 5 level a lot, and brought guys from James Madison, Curtis Rourke from Ohio, a couple of, I guess one of the receivers also came from Ohio, that Cignetti has said kind of from the beginning, he'd prefer the guy that's started a lot of games and has a lot of time on task rather than the guy that maybe showed a lot of promise but never really cracked a rotation at a bigger school. In terms of making this defense work and at least be able to make the kind of plays where I think about Indiana's 2007 season. I know you obviously weren't around for that, but statistically they weren't a great defense that year, but they were really good at getting to the quarterback and they were really good at intercepting passes. And, so the defense was able at very least to, create pressure, force mistakes, and then take advantage of those mistakes and give the ball back to an offense that could move the ball and score really, really well. I don't know how many players on the list of guys you need to be able to take that step up from the group of 5 level to the Big Ten. I don't know how many guys want someone like Mikael Kamara. What was that?
My browser, I was looking something up.
Unreal. Anyway, Mikael Kamara.
Yeah, you said it. I'll have a lot more. We're working on a kind of longer feature on him. He has a pretty unique story in terms of some really significant injury history that sort of derailed his career for essentially 2 years, shoulders problems and how he's overcome that. So look for that sort of later in fall camp.
I'm looking for it right now. The other
here I got something for you. So
okay, all right, here we go.
Quarterback. Um, he's not going to, sounds like, the competition's still on, and he's not going to name a starter before the week one. It sounds like, I'm going to trot the starter out there with the first snap, which is what Tom Allen did.
I like how he said we didn't name a starter that one year. We just trotted that guy out for the first snap, and then the postscript was, and he was player of the year. He made it sound like he played one snap, got hurt, and was never hurt.
Yada yada yada. He did do a blah blah blah. That could have been a good blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And that's what Tom Allen did the last couple of years. Do you think, what's the point of the subterfuge, or not even? Because I mean, he basically said, "I'm not looking for Rourke to get beat. He's the best guy." I mean, he didn't say best guy. He said, they went back and watched all the spring cut-ups, and they were more impressed than they even were. He's obviously got the experience edge. I mean, that was the one thing I find that is at odds with his I'm gonna win and I'm good and I've done this before. Like, why, knowing the quarterback, what's the issue?
Yeah, well, it's also weird because it's not like he's working that hard to conceal. Like somebody asked about Curtis Rourke at the podium, and he said, "I sleep a lot better at night knowing he's in the program." Anyone who was at the spring game will know that only one quarterback got snaps with the first team. You can also just look at it. I mean, I think Taven Jackson, he looked substantially better to me in that spring game.
It's separate from the competition, but it's separate from the competition.
There's nobody on this roster that has anything resembling the bona fides Rourke has. He's thrown for 7,600 yards, 50 touchdowns. He led his team to back-to-back bowls. He was MAC Offensive Player of the Year. Then he tore his ACL. Then he came back, spent the entire offseason rehabbing a torn ACL, and came back and led Ohio to another bowl game. So it's not
33 career starts is the key number, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that much of a mystery, I guess. So no, I don't know that my mind doesn't go straight from why won't he name a starter to, even though he says all I do is win, blah 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 blah, quoting Curt Cignetti. But I've never fully understood it, and while I'm sure everyone in Indiana's first month of games will have some GA cutting up clips of Taven Jackson's second half against Louisville just so that they're ready, I don't think anyone's going to be preparing for anyone but Curtis Rourke. And actually, what's interesting is one of the part of the primer I put down was position battles, and everybody's going to want to know who the starter is. And now Cignetti has said, "I'm not naming a starter. You're all just going to have to wait." But it's something that invariably is going to get asked in fall camp, as though it's not sort of obvious. I am fascinated by position battles in a lot of other spots. How do they cut up the running back room? Because you got a bunch of guys that have a lot of experience and can all do something a little bit different in that room. You've got a whole new wide receiver room. You've got some guys in that room that have the potential. Obviously, Elijah Sarrett is probably the big one to be really, really good, even at this level. Tight end, I know, is a little bit less. I mean, it's kind of one player on the field at a time most of the time. So it's a little bit less sexy, but I don't know exactly where they're going to go with tight end. I assume Zach Horton, the JMU transfer, will kind of have the inside lane there. Even offensive line, you would imagine at very least Bob Bostad will give some other players chances. Like a Bray Lynch, for example. If he shows up to fall camp and he's really good, then I don't know that a Trey Wedig, for example, can necessarily just sit here and assume he's starting and he's not going to have to go earn it. Quarterback, actually, in a weird way, is the position battle on the offense that, while it's probably going to get a lot of attention, and I understand why, it's maybe the one that interests me the least, because it's just hard for me to imagine Curtis Rourke being healthy and not starting. And if he isn't, then it is because one of these other quarterbacks turned into Joe Montana over the summer and just literally cannot be benched.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a ginormous upset if he's not the starter week one, and it would either speak to an injury, like you just said, or Tyler Cherry just found something over these last 3 months, and
it just turned out Caleb Williams 2.0, something like that.
Yeah. So but it was less about the sort of the competition part of it, because I get even if Rourke, who looks like sort of the front runner. You keep it open to keep, and especially in the day and age of the portal, you want to keep guys invested, and you want to pitch that, look, I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to win the jobs and all that. I just find it sort of silly at this point with all these coaches. And it's not just Curt Cignetti to be coy when a competition, you do have a clear front runner and you do have a guy, after these 2 weeks, why not just say, this is my guy. This is what we could talk about this open and honestly. And I can tell you why Curtis Rourke is won the job or what I expect from him. So now we have to wait till week 2 to do that. And maybe it's more of a media thing, but I just think fans want to hear it too. And it doesn't hurt to have Curtis Rourke, whose brother's in the NFL, as the face of your program right from the get-go. It's sort of my thing, especially with you're trying to build this, and Cignetti's trying to build this as sort of a place for quarterbacks to go.
The Maple Missile. I mean, you have to
And he's got the built-in nickname, so I mean, yeah,
coalesce around the Maple Missile.
Advantage. Yeah.
The last position group, we have about 3 minutes left, but just talking about the secondary. Indiana added obviously some really intriguing transfers. Basically just took Old Dominion's starting safeties. I did enjoy how Curt Cignetti just sort of went back to the Sun Belt and just sort of plucked, like, I think basically the best defensive players that he'd faced that were in the portal. D'Angelo Pons is the other big one, freshman All-American, according to multiple outlets from James Madison last season. One of the sort of most productive corners in the Sun Belt. Now he's another one where can you take that step up? Because Indiana hasn't really had a true lockdown corner since probably Tywan Mullen's best seasons, maybe some Jalen Williams as well. There is, you couple that to Josh Sanguinetti, Jameer Johnson, Jamari Sharp, JoJo Johnson, a couple other players like, Nick Toomer. There's a collection of talent back there. Like there is like an aggregate level of talent that I think could make that secondary work, but I just really don't know how it gets sort of laid out onto the field, like ones, twos. Here's who plays where. Here's the rotation. Indiana's gonna have to sort through that these next few weeks.
Well, when you talk about one thing that they do have is sort of a size deficiency. Sean Asbury's 5'10", D'Angelo Pons is 5'9". Nick Toomer was sort of the biggest body that back there. He played with the second team defense in the spring game. He's 6'2". So we talked a lot about these guys making the transfer from sort of, the Sun Belt and Old Dominion and JMU. They also have to overcome, there's some, the Big Ten receivers are going to be on a much bigger, on a more consistent, more physical, having to sort of overcome not just the jump in talent, but the jump in size and athleticism, and being a little bit undersized there, could make a difference. And so it is going to be hard to see how, what does that look like? What is that full group? Because they're going to use that third safety a little bit different than Tom Allen did, but they do use a third safety, and sort of like a 4-2-5 is kind of their base. How that all comes together.
We'll leave it there for now. Obviously, we're gonna have a lot to talk about, and we've got plenty of time to do it. Camp opens on Wednesday. We'll talk to Curt Cignetti on Wednesday. Maybe we'll do one of these at the end of the week as well, just to kind of keep the discussion moving forward on sort of what we're looking for as Indiana gets into the teeth of fall camp. But for now, for the Indianapolis Star, the Bloomington Herald-Times, he's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners for July 29th, 2024. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you very, very soon.